German artist and illustrator Josef Sattler was born in 1867 in the town of Schrobenhausen. Following an apprenticeship as a painter and gilder, he studied at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich and subsequently worked briefly for the Imperial Printing Office and at the School of Decorative Arts in Strasbourg. In the early 1890s, he began having his work published in magazines and journals, but more significantly in 1893, when he was 27 years old, he published what was quickly recognised as a major creative triumph. This was a collection of 16 traditional lithographs titled A Modern Dance of Death. It was a suitably dark series of compelling images which exploited our collective neurosis about the finite nature of our existence. They were printed using a limited palette of subdued colour, and he relied heavily on the kind of allegorical imagery first used in the Northern European Renaissance by artists such as Albrecht Dürer. In the wake of its success, the magazine La Plume arranged an exhibition of his work in Berlin, which greatly enhanced his reputation for graphic art. Sattler was also a popular choice to create bookplate designs, many of which also resonated with medievalist styling. And although they uniformly looked very much like wood-engraved images, they were actually, like virtually all his work, created lithographically. And as well as the creation of more book illustrations, in the same year he became involved with the arts magazine Pan, a rival to the far more popular Jugend. His involvement lasted for the 5 years of Pan's existence, but despite his many attractive contributions and those of others, the magazine ceased publication in 1900. But in that year he published his second major creative achievement, an illustrated edition of Die Nibelungen, an epic poem of Teutonic legend originally written sometime around 1200. All the illustrations were rendered using strong calligraphic lines, and they were formally composed with tasteful application of limited colour runs to create dramatic, compelling narrative images. Only 200 copies of this highly collectible volume were printed, and it was also exhibited at the 1900 Paris Art Nouveau exposition, where it was an immensely popular exhibit. In 1904, Sattler relocated to Strasbourg, but maintained his professional associations in Munich, and in 1905 he returned to his abiding fixation with death for Die Rheinland, a volume of Germanic art published by Wilhelm Schaefer. Evidence of his work declined sharply in subsequent years, and particularly during the years of the Great War, but what work he did have published was mostly in the pages of the satirical magazine Fliegende Blätter, and the work he created for them was generally lighter in tone than most of his earlier imagery, although the medieval influence endured here too. Following the end of the war he moved back to Munich, and although his work continued to appear in Fliegende Blätter, Sattler increasingly involved himself in the creation of lithographic prints up to his eventual death in 1931 at the age of 64. Don Philip Crane was born in 1878 in Springfield, Greene County, Missouri, but the family moved around several times before eventually settling in Chicago around 1890. He didn't have any formal art education, and the earliest verified work I found by him was a couple of gouache paintings created in 1907 when he moved to New Mexico, and I have no idea what they may have been for. In that year he also illustrated this sheet music cover, but otherwise I found nothing before 1909 and the publication of the book Chats with Colourkin, written by W.L. Hubbard. This book contained a relatively small number of line-only monochromes by Crane, but all revealed strong visual imagination and graphic control. But another absence of examples lasting just over a decade followed before Crane's most significant body of illustration began in 1920, with the production of a vast number of images for a set of children's books collected under the generic heading My Book House. Each volume was themed, and the set, which eventually ran to 12 volumes, covered a wide range of subjects, from fairy tales, myths and fables, the works of Shakespeare and other literary classics, retold and condensed by the writer Olive Beaupre Miller. The only other work I found was a pair of far from typical but accomplished painted images, published in 1922, but I don't know what for. and in 1928 he made visual contributions to another less extensive series titled Book Trails. And although these books featured work by several illustrators, he produced the fanciful panoramic end papers and a handful of page illustrations. But everything else I found appears to have been published as part of the popular Bookhouse series throughout the decade and into the next. Some of this work was printed as monochrome pen and ink, and although many more illustrations were published in colour of one sort or another, Crane's contribution was entirely created as tightly controlled expressive pen and ink in black and white, and the colour added at printing. It was usually 2 or 3 colours at most, and made use of what in the USA are known as Ben-Day dots, and in Britain half-tone screens. This allowed for tints of the main colours used and was widely used in the production of comic books at that time and for quite a while to come. Whether he had any say in the process I have no idea, but it was frequently the case that at this time the illustrator had no control over what the publishers did with their work. There were many highlights among the large volume of images he created for this set of books, and among them was undoubtedly his visual interpretation of Dante's epic 14th century poem, The Divine Comedy, which despite its title was anything but. The images he created for the visualization of this classic nightmare were uniformly compelling and imaginative, and in this instance at least the application of limited colour did actually enhance the illustrations in aesthetic terms and increase their hellish narrative appeal considerably, which makes me wonder whether Crane did have a hand in their production. Unfortunately, I have no idea what, if anything, he may have worked on besides this series, and all I'm able to add is that Don P. Crane died in 1944 in Chicago at the age of 66 and has been neglected ever since. The illustrator Zig Brunner was born in Warsaw, Poland in 1878 and relocated to Paris at the turn of the century when he would have been about 22. Whether he had any formal art training either in Warsaw or Paris isn't recorded. By 1905 he was creating fashion illustrations for the influential magazine La Gazette du Bon Temps, which he drew in pen and ink line but were printed as colour pochoirs. Although he continued at least sporadically to work for La Gazette, his more erotic and comedic work also began to appear with greater frequency in pretty much all the Parisian humour magazines. And his light graphic touch and risque humour proved to be ideally suited to the exuberance of the Belle Epoque. During the first decade of the century, his images were most frequently to be found in Le Rire, Le Sourire and Fantasio, and this remained the case up to the outbreak of the Great War in 1914. And when La Bayonette was first published in 1915 as a direct response to the conflict, he became a regular in their pages too. It seems he didn't fight during the war, and maybe as a Pole he wasn't considered eligible, but he also began creating more erotic material for La Vie Parisienne at this time, and there was no shortage of demand for his illustration, some of which referred directly to the war and some of which avoided it completely in favour of more frivolous material. And his career continued to flourish in the post-war years and the permissive mood of what the French call les années folles. Plus ça change had been a whimsical dramatic production which had first been performed in 1915, and Brunner created a line and pochoir illustrated limited edition of the play in 1922, which proved every bit as popular as the play had been, and all copies sold out quickly to collectors. Brunner still produced fashion illustration during the decade, particularly for the magazine Femina, and he still kept a presence in La Vie Parisienne with more eroticism and humour. But by the end of the 1920s, evidence of his work for magazines of any kind reduced dramatically. He did illustrate an edition of the book Gamiani by Alfred de Musset, with many colour images far too obscene for this platform. And in 1931 he created a series of fine pen and ink monochromes for the considerably more respectable Altesse Royale by Thomas Mann. It's possible that following this he returned to working as a painter, but the only later illustration work I found was a series of hurried-looking watercolours for the book Histoire d'un Nuage in 1950. And Zig Brunner died in Paris in 1961 at the age of 82. Swedish poster designer Erik Roman was born in Nyköping in 1891 but grew up in Helsingborg, and after completing his school education he went on to study art in Gothenburg. While still a student, he earned some money illustrating press ads for local newspapers, but other than a reckless journey he made crossing the Baltic Sea in a very basic sailboat, the following years are unrecorded until 1917 when his poster career began. As luck would have it, Roman's older brother was the manager of one of the biggest Swedish cinema chains, and there was a great demand for posters for films that were being screened throughout the country at this time. Needless to say, nepotism obviously played a part in him being hired, but I doubt his brother would have continued to use his sibling had the posters not been popular. In the early stages in particular, Roman actually created his posters from lino cuts, with which he was adept, and the very limitations of this technique gave the images a particularly modernist look and were usually limited to only a few colours. Within a few years he was also creating posters using more conventional but no less striking drawn lithographic images, and there's no doubt that these more graphically subtle illustrations were better suited to more dramatic, subtly emotional films of the period. His posters proved very popular with the Swedish public, and the German magazine Das Plakat claimed that Roman was the only illustrator in Sweden who was working full-time in poster art at the time. And it's easy to see how this could have been the case. And from the mid-1920s onward, his posters demonstrated not only considerable graphic diversity, but also an abiding aesthetic consideration of all elements in the posters, including the use of letterforms and compositional balance. It was by no means an unbroken rule, but as time went on it tended to be comedy films for which he retained his simpler flat solutions, even if by now he was no longer using lino cuts. And although he had occasionally ventured into the use of the mechanical airbrush a few years earlier, in the mid to late 1930s it featured increasingly in the portraits he created of the stars of any given production, frequently mixed with flat graphic elements and dynamic visual results. He continued to be largely unchallenged as Sweden's poster king, and by the 1940s it's recorded that 4 or 5 posters were created in any given week. And what had begun as dynamic but basic lino-cut imagery and text had by his later career evolved into a range of styles and applications of line and colour of considerable versatility and graphic diversity. I found no examples from the years of the Second World War, and sadly only a couple from 1947 and 1948, the last of which was the only example I found that wasn't for a film. And having created more than 7,000 posters in his career, Erik Roman died in 1949 at the age of only 58. Thanks as ever for your interest, and I'll upload some more soon.